next we will look at the product requirement template. So to give a high-level overview, the project has around almost close to a dozen elements, starting from the context to release objectives to scope and boundaries, risk assumptions, personas, user stories, introducing the idea of impact maps here. It's a very interesting idea I have encountered, and I think it's very valuable in the way we actually describe the system. Technical requirements we're calling non-functional requirements, and finally the visualization requirements such as mockups and sketches and any high fidelity mockups if you were to do. So high level context is we should be setting up the high level context in the document by stating who the key players are, stakeholders, product owner, team. Also, if the customer and sponsor, because I think that really influences the team very to know that who the customer is and what the customer interests are. Then status, whether it's on target or we're moving into a risky situation of a delayed or deferred projects and so on and so forth. Timelines, and then it's a good idea to give us some context vis-a-vis roadmap in terms of milestones and where we are today and where we want to be in the roadmap next step. So that gives team a direction for at least next few sprints. Next is objectives, business objectives, to basically highlight them as statements like increase user adoption by 20% and so on and so forth. And technical objectives, team goals, the goals which essentially the product team will have, which could be complementary to the business goals, and technical objectives, such as ramping up team members on specific technology or even expanding the team capability by outsourcing part of the product development. And finally, process objective, which is that adoption of new process such as design thinking or agile methods if the team is not agile, prototyping or those ideas. And finally, the objectives should be SMART, which is the acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. That really kind of gives, being specific and measurable gives us a very good goal, which is objective and tangible versus abstract goals. Scope and boundaries is the next section, which basically scope obviously highlights the key deliverables and functionality. Also, technical and architectural scope as well. So, where the boundaries are important are boundaries essentially tell us where we're going to stop. For example, what not to do or not to get over ambitious. So, for example, we can say MVP will be rolled out in US only. So, do not invest any effort on internationalization. Or we can say initially we're going to integrate with only two CRM, Salesforce and Sugar CRM. So let's keep our focus on these two. Initially rather than and get the proof of concept or the validation for the product up and running fast. So idea is to create a boundary where we don't overextend the team. Next is a template for user stories, and user stories is very standard. Like it is brief statement of intent, and then invest properties, which is independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, and small and testable. User stories is a good place to use personas or discover personas. So it is a good idea to write stories using personas. And it is a must to have. Every story must have an acceptance criteria. So what is acceptable? What is the acceptable outcome of or impact of the story? Should be very clearly defined. And it's useful to basically define the value area, whether it's a business story or it's an architectural story in terms of technical debt, and of course priority. Personas. So personas are very, very valuable, as I mentioned earlier. Should be discovered from user stories. That's the best place, and not fabricated out of thin air. Good to create empathy maps by interviewing the users or other stakeholders of the system, understanding their need, the background, the environment, how they're using it. Personas can drive system design because that's what you're building the system for. They represent the end users. And one final thing about personas, need to sort of contain the number of personas. Typically, sometimes we become very fine-grained and we have too many personas. So idea is to just contain them and abstract them to the right level. Next is the visual requirements. So visual requirements are very valuable to support the stories. So we can start with sketches, simple sketches, hand done sketches, or whiteboard sketches, and subsequent to that is essentially we can create a low fidelity or high fidelity mockups depending on what the need of the product is, or the development team's need is. Sometimes low fidelity mockups are sufficient, uh, and other times when we are trying to sort of get the look and feel approved by the customer, then high fidelity mockups are valuable, and creating sitemap is very valuable. And then we can typically use tools such as Azure or Balsamic to put these mockups in place. Next is assumptions. So there are several assumptions we basically make, and one of them is first of all is environment assumption. That is what the environment is. If we don't know the environment very clearly and we don't have the luxury to know the environment very much, then we have to make certain assumptions there. We then the second kind of assumptions are the user assumption, who the user is, or what the user needs are. Next is the need assumption, that is user needs versus sometimes we build the products in a closet, and stakeholders start building the products versus understanding user needs clearly, and so we make assumptions there. These are the ones they're latent and they need to be sort of validated. Uh, and then the solution assumptions in terms of what the solution will interact with, whether the solution will assume mobile to be there or not there, or network to be reliable or not reliable, or uh, certain, for example, CRM system to be there or not. CRM system to be having schemas is an assumption which needs to be validated. And finally, we need to identify the high risk assumptions out of these assumptions and make sure that we are aware of them, and we need to sort of they actually segue nicely into our next section, which is risk management and the risk part of the template. So there could be several risks, like technology risks, proven or unproven technology, or even the proof of concept of whatever the idea, the core idea is, whether it's workable. For example, can we really discover the right kind of collaborators using machine learning or not, or do we have the right kind of technology to essentially do that? Uh, Resource risk, do we have the right kind of people, or will we be able to get the right kind of people on board to deliver the product? Then scope risk. If we don't have a very well managed requirement process, we can start creeping the scope, and then that can derail the product and the timelines. And finally, time and budget risk. That what is the tolerance for overage in the product uh, time, and or whether the time is so critical that we are going to miss something like a season or a specific event. And of course, there are several ways uh, to handle the risk, but the idea is to identify the risk in two dimensions, which is probability of it happening and its impact on the product success. And of course, then several ways to go about it. Avoiding it, we can mitigate risk upfront or as we go, or we can transfer the risk by, for example, um, we can uh, use, as we're doing in this art product, is use third-party services right now rather than building them ourselves. And or finally, some risks we have to accept, right? And that's part of the game. Uh, Next is non-functional requirements. So these are essentially system boundaries, and they basically are. I'm just highlighting the high-level categories, not exact non-functional requirement line items. So architectural, which are essentially scalability and performance and that area, usability in terms of response time and uh, ease of learning the system by the end user, operational in terms of availability and scaling and so on and so forth, and security requirements in terms of access control, authorization, data uh, encryption at rest or in transit, and finally compliance requirements that the data can be in particular location or particular country, cannot travel outside the country. Those kind of requirements could be there which can impact the system significantly. So now we're going to talk about impact max. This is a really cool idea which I like a lot, and essentially it summarizes and scopes the system visually. And it is useful to identify underlying assumptions. It should be developed by senior business and technical stakeholders, really, and to summarize and can be included as part of the PRD. Uh, it essentially enables business goals to drive the product, as we can see from the diagram. It definitely helps abstracting the personas because they tie in nicely. And finally, the deliverables essentially map to the impact, they support it. And what I find is that impact maps is a little bit of effort, but not a lot. It definitely creates a shared understanding between business and the product team. So how they fit into the larger flow is basically uh, it maps through why and how, uh, and starting with impact mapping, we can drive the goals and impacts, and then deliverables from there. And from deliverables, you basically can high level do the story mapping, taking deliverables and create user activity and epics there. And that lends very nicely, dovetails nicely into the agile user stories, acceptance criteria, and examples.